Dr. Robert Mitchell pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the observation window, watching the aliens file into the conference room below. The Krell were impossible to ignore, nearly 9 feet tall, with 4 muscular arms that moved with an unsettling grace. Their fur rippled with colors that shouldn't exist, shifting from deep purple to electric blue as they walked. What bothered Robert most wasn't their size or their alien appearance. It was the way they looked at humanity. Like we were insects. Like we were beneath their notice. Ambassador Patricia Walsh sat rigidly at the head of the negotiation table, shuffling papers with trembling hands. Robert could see the sweat on her forehead from 3 stories up. She'd been preparing for this meeting for weeks, practicing every diplomatic phrase, every gesture of goodwill. It didn't matter. The Krell didn't want to hear it. For 3 years, Earth had tried everything. Formal requests, scientific exchanges, cultural demonstrations. Nothing worked. The aliens would arrive, listen to whatever humanity had prepared, and leave with nothing but dismissal. Their chittering sounds, somewhere between a cat's purr and breaking glass, had become the soundtrack to Earth's diplomatic failure. Scientists said the sounds were just their way of communicating. Robert suspected it was laughter. Commander James Rodriguez stood beside Dr. Elena Foster, both of them gripping their folders like life preservers. Elena was the best xenolinguist Earth had to offer. She'd spent 3 years studying Krell communication patterns, filling notebooks with theories and analysis. She'd learned 17 different vocal registers, mapped out their gesture language, studied everything recorded about their culture. And it still hadn't been enough to get through to them. "This is going to be another waste of time," Rodriguez muttered, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. Robert didn't respond. He was too busy watching the doors at the far end of the conference room. Any second now, Patricia would make her opening statement. Any second now, the Krell would reject them again and humanity would be back to square one. Back to wondering if they'd ever find their place among the stars, or if they were destined to remain alone, primitive, forgotten. Then the doors opened again. His son walked through. Tyler Mitchell was 12 years old, small for his age, with messy brown hair that never quite stayed combed. He wore the same rumpled clothes he'd worn yesterday, a faded hoodie with a coffee stain on the sleeve and jeans with a hole in the knee. In his hands was a notebook, its pages creased and worn from constant use, covered in sketches and scattered notes written in his familiar handwriting. Robert felt his stomach drop. What is he doing? Elena breathed beside him, though she was still upstairs in the observation room, not in the conference room itself. "Oh no," Rodriguez whispered. But Robert just watched. He knew exactly what his son was doing down there. He'd known what Tyler was planning and he'd given his permission anyway. Maybe that made him crazy. Maybe that made him a terrible father. But he also knew something nobody else in this room knew yet. The Krell delegation went completely silent. Then the chittering started. But this wasn't the dismissive chatter from before. This was louder, more intense, echoing through the conference room and up to where the observers stood. It sounded like breaking glass mixed with the purring of an enormous cat. It sounded like laughter, contemptuous, mocking laughter. Patricia Walsh's face went pale. She looked like she wanted to stop Tyler, but she seemed frozen, unsure what to do. Tyler just stood there, holding his notebook, completely unfazed by the alien derision directed at him. He was used to being underestimated. He was used to adults thinking he was too young, too small, too much of an oddball to matter. School had taught him that lesson well enough. "This is a disaster," Rodriguez said flatly. "The kid just made things worse." But Robert kept watching his son. Kept watching the way Tyler's eyes scanned the room, cataloging details, processing information. His lips moved slightly. Tyler did that when he was thinking hard about something, silently working through problems in his head. The adults in the room thought he was nervous or confused. Robert knew better. Tyler was analyzing. Down in the conference room, speaker of resonance, the lead Krell, identifiable by the silver markings across his fur, made a gesture with all 4 arms. It was a gesture of dismissal, of supreme indifference. He turned away from Tyler as if the boy wasn't worth acknowledging. Patricia cleared her throat, trying to salvage the situation. But before she could speak, Tyler did something unexpected. He opened his notebook and pointed at one of his sketches. Then he pointed at the Krell's hand gestures. Then back at his notes. Then at the way the aliens' vocal patterns had shifted during their laughter. There was a pause. A long, heavy pause where nothing moved and nobody breathed. The Krell stopped. All of them. Even speaker of resonance turned back around. And Robert Mitchell, watching from above, felt something shift in the universe. His son had just done what 3 years of professional diplomacy had failed to do. He'd made the Krell actually look at him. The research lab smelled like stale coffee and electricity. Tyler Mitchell hadn't left in 3 days. Not that he'd counted the days deliberately, he just looked up from his work one moment and realized the sun was rising again, and then it was setting again, and then it was rising once more. Time had become this slippery thing that didn't matter much anymore. Around him, holographic displays floated in the dim air, each one showing different recordings of Krell communication. Sound waves rippled across some screens in impossible colors, blues and greens and purples that shifted and moved like living things. On other screens, video clips played on loop. Krell aliens making gestures, their forearms moving in synchronized patterns, their mouths opening to produce those strange, layered sounds. Dr. Elena Foster had been here earlier, back when Tyler could still remember what time of day it was. She'd stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, looking tired and disappointed, the way most adults did when they looked at him. "Tyler, you need to approach this systematically," she'd said, gesturing at his work. "You can't just throw data at a wall and see what sticks. There's a methodology to linguistic analysis. We have frameworks, established procedures." "The frameworks don't work," Tyler had replied, not even looking up from his notes. He was in the middle of something, following a thread that had just started to make sense. Elena had sighed. "That's not how science works. You can't just ignore methodology because you feel like it. You're a child, Tyler. You don't have the training or experience to know what you're doing." Tyler had nodded politely, the way his mother had taught him to acknowledge adults, even when they were wrong. Then he turned back to his screens the moment she left the room. He had work to do, and Elena Foster, despite being smart, wasn't seeing what he was seeing. The Krell language wasn't simple. That was the problem everyone else kept running into. They kept treating it like human language, linear, sequential, one word following another in a straight line. But it wasn't. It was so much more complicated than that. Tyler had discovered it by accident, really. He'd been listening to a recording of the aliens chittering, the same clip he'd heard 100 times before, when he'd noticed something odd. There were 2 different sounds happening at the same time. No, not 2. 3. No, actually, more like 5 or 6 sounds layered on top of each other, all occurring simultaneously, but at different frequencies that human ears naturally filtered out. It was like looking at a painting and suddenly realizing there was a hidden image beneath the obvious one. Once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. That's when Tyler had really started digging. He'd pulled every single recording of Krell communication Earth had collected over the years. Diplomatic meetings, scientific exchanges, even casual interactions between Krell traders and human port workers. He'd fed them all into the analysis software, told the computer to break down the sounds into their component frequencies, to separate the layers. What emerged was unlike anything linguists had expected. The Krell didn't just speak words. They layered meaning. A single sound could mean something completely different depending on what frequency it was produced at. A growl that meant agreement at one frequency might mean danger at another. A purr that signified friendship at a lower register could signal contempt at a higher one. But there was more. Tyler had noticed patterns. Mathematical patterns. Hidden beneath the vocal layers were sequences of numbers. Prime numbers arranged in specific orders. Fibonacci spirals woven into the rhythm of their speech. Mathematical constants that appeared over and over again, embedded like hidden messages in the structure of their language itself. Tyler's hands had started shaking when he'd first noticed it. The Krell language wasn't natural. It was designed. It was engineering on a level that made human communication look like caveman grunts. Whoever had created this language, or whatever species had engineered it for the Krell, had understood mathematics, physics, and the fundamental structure of the universe in ways humans were only beginning to grasp. And they'd baked all of that understanding directly into how they talked to each other. The adult linguists kept saying Tyler was being reckless, that he was working without proper structure or peer review. But they didn't understand what he was doing because they were looking at the problem wrong. They wanted to approach it piece by piece, breaking it down into manageable chunks. Tyler saw it all at once. The whole thing, interconnected and beautiful and impossibly complex. His mother, Rebecca, had tried to get him to sleep. She'd come into the lab with sandwiches and fresh coffee and that worried expression mothers get when they think their kids are pushing themselves too hard. She'd sat beside him and tried to convince him that rest was important, that he couldn't work forever. But Tyler had nodded and kept working, and eventually she'd given up, leaving the food on the desk beside him. He'd eaten some of it, he thought. Maybe. Time had gotten weird again. 13 days. That's how long he'd been at it before his body finally started to shut down. His vision was getting blurry. His fingers felt numb. His thoughts were starting to move like they were underwater, slow and heavy. But he didn't care about any of that. Because he was close. So close to understanding something that nobody else had grasped. Something that would change everything about how humans understood the Krell, about how they understood communication itself. Tyler pulled up another recording and hit play. The Krell sounds filled the lab once more. But this time he could hear it. All the layers. All the hidden meaning beneath the sound. All the mathematics singing underneath like a second language, speaking truths that went deeper than words. He was beginning to understand how to think like them. The conference room had been prepared for another formal diplomatic meeting. Long tables arranged in careful angles. Holographic displays ready to showcase Earth's latest offerings and proposals. Ambassador Patricia Walsh stood near the entrance, her suit pressed, her hair perfect, her smile practiced and professional. This was her job. This was what she'd trained for her entire career. Then Tyler Mitchell walked in and everything changed. He looked terrible, honestly. His clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the research lab. His hair stood up at odd angles like he'd forgotten what a comb was. There were dark circles under his eyes that made him look decades older than 12. His father had tried to convince him to go home, shower, sleep for at least 8 hours before attempting this. Tyler had refused. He said the longer he waited, the more the patterns would fade from his mind, and he needed them fresh, vivid, burning bright in his memory. Commander Rodriguez stood beside Robert Mitchell in the observation room above, shaking his head. The kid looks like he hasn't slept in a week. He's not going to be able to do this. Robert didn't respond. He was watching his son move into the center of the conference room, watching Tyler's face, trying to read what was going through that brilliant, chaotic mind. Tyler stood directly in front of the Krell delegation. Speaker of Resonance sat at the head of their group, his massive frame somehow managing to look both relaxed and intensely alert at the same time. The other 3 Krell flanked him, guards probably or maybe just colleagues. Their fur rippled with those impossible colors as they watched the small human boy with what might have been curiosity. Tyler, Patricia began carefully, perhaps we should sit down first, Anne. But Tyler wasn't listening. His eyes were closed. His hands were at his sides, fingers slightly curled, trembling just a little. He was doing something. Something internal. Something like meditation or prayer or maybe just gathering courage. Then he opened his mouth. What came out wasn't quite human speech. It was something between singing and speaking, a sound that seemed to originate from deep in his chest and then transform as it moved up through his throat. His voice cracked and wavered, hitting notes it had no business hitting, making frequencies that seemed to bend the air itself. It was beautiful and terrible and completely wrong, and absolutely, unmistakably Krell. The conference room went silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for someone to finish speaking. This was a shocked, stunned silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone does something so unexpected, so unprecedented, that everyone's brain needs a moment to process what just happened. Tyler continued, pushing harder, finding the rhythm. His voice layered sounds on top of each other. A low growl rumbling beneath a higher-pitched trill, mathematical patterns buried in the rhythm like a heartbeat. His body moved slightly as he spoke, his hands making gestures that seemed to mirror the sounds, his face contorting with effort as he tried to produce frequencies his human vocal cords were never designed to create. It wasn't perfect. There were places where his voice cracked. Moments where the harmonics fell apart. Times when he clearly couldn't quite hit the right frequency and had to adjust, try again. But it was close. Close enough that anyone listening could understand what he was attempting to do. He was speaking their language. Speaker of Resonance stood up slowly. All 4 of his arms lowered to his sides in a synchronized movement, a gesture that seemed to drain the room of air. The other Krell followed suit, rising from their seats, all 4 arms lowered in unison. In the observation room, Elena Foster gasped. That's a gesture of profound respect. They only do that for. I don't know what they only do that for. Tyler's voice faded. He stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, his whole body shaking from the effort of what he'd just attempted. His human throat felt scraped raw. His jaw ached. But he was still standing. Still present. Still there. Speaker of Resonance took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, clearly meant to be non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost gentle. How does something so small comprehend our greatest achievement? The words came through the translation device in perfect English, but even through the mechanical voice of the translator, something of the wonder and confusion in the alien's tone came through. How does a creature with such limited physiology grasp the architecture of our language? We have spent millennia perfecting it. We have encoded the mathematics of reality itself into our speech. Yet you, A child, barely formed, your nervous system still developing. You heard it. You understood it. Everyone was looking at Tyler. Robert held his breath, waiting to see what his son would say. Waiting to see if the boy would freeze up, would become shy, would retreat into himself the way he sometimes did when attention turned to him. But Tyler just looked at Speaker of Resonance with those tired eyes, and he spoke in simple English, his voice hoarse from the effort of speaking Krell. I listen to how it thinks, Tyler said quietly. Not just what it says. Your language, it's not just about words. It's about the way your mind works. The way you see the universe. So I tried to listen like your mind listens. I tried to think the way you think. The Krell made a sound. A low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the entire conference room, through the observation room above, through everyone's chest cavity. It sounded like distant thunder rolling across a sky made of stars. It sounded like approval. The weeks that followed were like watching someone slowly turn up the volume on a radio that had been playing static for years. Now that the Krell were actually willing to communicate with humanity, now that they had someone who could bridge the gap between their layered, mathematical language and human understanding, everything began to shift. Tyler worked with Speaker of Resonance in a specially prepared room that had acoustic panels on every wall. The Krell had explained, through Tyler's translations, that human conference rooms were acoustically terrible for their language. All those hard surfaces just scattered their frequencies into useless noise. They needed a space where the mathematical patterns could be preserved, where the hidden meanings wouldn't get lost in echo and reverberation. Robert Mitchell watched his son work through the observation window, and he barely recognized the kid staring back at him. Tyler had stopped looking exhausted and started looking purposeful. His clothes were cleaner now, his mother had insisted on that, but his eyes had this intensity to them, like he could see layers of reality that nobody else could perceive. What is he saying? Patricia Walsh asked, standing beside Robert. She'd been spending more and more time here watching the progress, trying to understand what was happening in real time. What are they actually communicating? Robert shook his head. We won't know until Tyler translates. He says it's not just about converting words. There's context, history, nuance. He has to make sure the human understanding matches the Krell meaning, and apparently that's a lot harder than it sounds. Inside the room, Tyler sat across from Speaker of Resonance, a recording device capturing everything. Tyler would speak in English, asking questions. Speaker of Resonance would respond in Krell, his voice layering those impossible frequencies, his forearms making gestures that seemed to punctuate meaning in ways that speech alone couldn't convey. Then Tyler would sit very still for a long time, his eyes unfocused, his mind clearly working through something immensely complicated. He's reconstructing the meaning in his head, Elena Foster had explained to the gathered observers. He's not just translating word for word. He's understanding the conceptual architecture of what the Krell are saying and then finding the best way to express that in human language. I've never seen anything like it. 3 weeks into the translation process, Tyler came to his father's office late in the evening. Robert was working through diplomatic reports, trying to figure out how to prepare humanity for whatever news was coming. Tyler looked even more tired than he had during his initial obsessive research phase, but he also looked certain about something. Dad, Tyler said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation, the Krell have been protecting us. Robert set down his tablet. Protecting us from what? From the rest of the galaxy, Tyler said simply. They've known about Earth for a long time. Longer than we realized. Before we even knew they existed, they knew about us. And they've been blocking other species from making contact. Keeping us isolated. Keeping us safe. Robert felt something shift in his chest. Why would they do that? Because we weren't ready, Tyler explained, and he spoke like someone who'd had this conversation explained to him multiple times, like he'd had to really wrap his head around the concept. The galaxy is full of species, Dad. Thousands of them. Millions maybe. And a lot of them don't think like we do. They don't value individual life the way we do. They don't care about concepts like freedom or choice or self-determination. To them, humans would just be resources or problems to be solved. Patricia Walsh had come in halfway through the conversation, and now she was standing in the doorway listening, her face going through various stages of shock and processing. But the Krell saw something different, Tyler continued, his young voice steady and serious. They watched us. For decades they studied humanity. They were waiting to see if we could grow beyond our limitations. They were waiting to see if we could learn to understand ways of thinking that are completely alien to us. Not just accept them intellectually but actually understand them from the inside. And they thought you could prove that? Robert asked carefully. Tyler shook his head. They thought humanity could prove that. They were testing us. They kept coming here, kept trying to communicate, but in ways that didn't work with our normal methods. They were deliberately challenging us to think differently. And every time we failed, it meant we weren't ready yet. But when I showed up, when I approached their language not like a linguistics problem but like a puzzle, like something that required a completely different way of thinking. Tyler trailed off, then shrugged. I guess that was the test they were looking for. Patricia had moved into the office now, and she was staring at Tyler like he'd just revealed the meaning of life itself. So what you're telling me, she said slowly, is that they've been waiting for proof that humanity could think beyond our normal patterns. That we could be flexible enough, creative enough, different enough to join them in whatever community they're part of. Yeah, Tyler confirmed. And they want to know if we have others like me. People whose brains work in ways that are unconventional, different. People who see things other people miss. Robert looked at his son, this small boy who'd never quite fit in at school, who'd been bullied for being weird, who spent hours alone following patterns that nobody else could see. This boy who every teacher had quietly suggested might benefit from special education programs. This boy who'd been the outcast, the oddball, the one who didn't think like everyone else. He'd just saved humanity's place in the galaxy. Elena Foster arrived about an hour later, and when Tyler explained it all again, her response was almost spiritual. She sat down slowly in Robert's chair like her legs had stopped working. All this time, she whispered, I thought the Krell were intellectually superior to us. I thought they were just waiting for us to prove we weren't complete idiots. She looked at Tyler with something like awe. But it wasn't about being smarter. It was about being different. They were looking for humans who could think in ways that broke the normal patterns. And apparently, Tyler said with the kind of dry observation only a 12-year-old genius could manage, Earth is full of us. People with autism, people with ADHD, people whose minds work in ways that don't fit into normal categories. The Krell said that those people, we could be humanity's greatest strength. Not despite thinking differently but because of it. Ambassador Patricia Walsh stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights of the diplomatic sector. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made. Reports were being filed. The news was beginning to spread that Earth had finally made contact with an alien species, and not just made contact, but had been offered a place among them. Not because of military strength. Not because of economic power or political influence. Because one kid who didn't fit in anywhere had finally found a place where his weird, wonderful, unconventional mind was exactly what the universe needed. 6 months after Tyler first spoke Krell in that conference room, the world had transformed in ways that seemed impossible. The ceremony was being held in Geneva, in a massive hall that had been hastily renovated to accommodate both human dignitaries and a delegation of Krell who'd decided to stay on Earth for the formal establishment of diplomatic relations. Tyler stood backstage with 11 other children. They ranged in age from 8 to 15. Some of them were nervous, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Others seemed completely calm, lost in their own worlds. One girl, named Keisha, was humming to herself. A complex, mathematical humming that followed patterns most people wouldn't even notice. Another boy, Marcus, was doing mental calculations, his lips moving silently as he worked through numbers that existed only in his head. These were the children that Commander Rodriguez's new initiative had identified. The different ones. The ones who didn't fit into normal schools, normal social structures, normal ways of thinking. The ones who'd been called weird, broken, wrong. The ones who teachers had quietly suggested needed special help or different environments. The ones who, in a world that valued conformity above almost everything else, had learned to feel like failures. Now they were Earth's greatest resource. You nervous? Tyler asked the girl next to him. Her name was Aisha, and she could see into the ultraviolet spectrum naturally. Her brain just processed light differently than other humans. She'd spent most of her life being told she was lying about what she could see. Aisha shook her head. Not really. I've already met the Krell. They don't care if you're nervous. They just care if you can think. It was such a simple statement, but it contained the entire revolution. Nobody cared if they were nervous. Nobody was going to dismiss them for being awkward or socially uncomfortable or strange. The Krell understood that intelligence came in many forms, and that the kind of thinking humanity had been suppressing for centuries might be the most valuable thinking of all. The ceremony itself was strange. There were speeches, of course, politicians who wanted to take credit for what had happened, even though they'd actively opposed bringing Tyler into the process. There were handshakes and photographs and the kind of diplomatic theater that Robert Mitchell watched with barely concealed amusement. But the real moment came when Speaker of Resonance entered with his delegation. The alien's fur rippled through its color spectrum as he approached the group of neurodivergent children. When he spoke, his voice came through the translator with clear warmth. "We see you," Speaker of Resonance said, addressing the children directly. "The ones your own species call different. The ones whose minds work in ways that do not match the patterns of your majority. We see you and we recognize you as the future of human civilization. You are not broken. You are not wrong. You are evolution. You are the next step." Tyler felt something tight in his chest loosen. He'd spent most of his life being made to feel like there was something wrong with him. School had been torture, not because the academics were hard but because his brain worked differently and nobody around him knew how to handle that. His classmates had mocked him. Teachers had been frustrated by his inability to follow standard classroom procedures, even though he understood the material better than anyone in the room. His own mother had taken him to doctors, looking for a cure to his condition. There was nothing wrong with him to cure. He just thought in ways that didn't match what society had decided was normal. And now, here were aliens who understood that better than most humans. Dr. Elena Foster stood to the side of the stage, and when Tyler caught her eye, she nodded to him. There was genuine respect there now, replacing the skepticism that had clouded her expression for so long. She'd been part of the problem, part of the system that had tried to force Tyler into normal patterns. But she was also smart enough to learn, to evolve, to recognize her own mistakes. "I want to apologize," she'd said to Tyler just before the ceremony in private. "I didn't believe in you. I thought I knew better because I had degrees and experience. But you taught me something I should have known all along, that being different isn't a flaw. It's an asset." Robert Mitchell stood with Patricia Walsh, watching his son interact with the Krell scholars. Tyler was discussing mathematics with them, his hands moving in excited gestures, his face alive with the kind of joy that only comes from being completely understood by people around you. It was a far cry from the isolated, anxious kid who'd spent 13 days alone in a research lab. Patricia squeezed Robert's arm. "You knew," she said quietly. "You knew this would work." "I knew Tyler could do something special," Robert replied, watching his son. "I didn't know it would change everything." "The Krell are already talking about establishing educational centers," Patricia continued. "Places where kids like Tyler and Aisha and Marcus can learn and develop their abilities. They want to do the same thing on their homeworld, identify their own neurodivergent individuals and create systems that value them instead of suppress them." Over the following weeks, the news spread across human media in ways both inspiring and controversial. Some people celebrated the revelation that neurodivergent thinking could be valuable. Others reacted defensively, claiming that normal was normal for a reason, that there was something inherently wrong with being different. But the children didn't care about the debate. They were too busy learning. Tyler spent his days in collaboration with Krell scholars, diving deeper into the mathematical structures underlying their language. Aisha was working with Krell scientists studying light and energy, teaching them things about the ultraviolet spectrum that even their advanced technology had missed. Marcus was helping develop new computational systems based on probability calculations that his unique brain could perform intuitively. 1 year after the ceremony, the Krell formally issued a statement to the galactic community. It came through in Tyler's translation, layered with all the mathematical complexity and emotional weight that Krell communication carried. "The small one taught us something profound," the statement read, Speaker of Resonance voice coming through the translation device with unmistakable pride. "True civilization does not erase difference. True civilization celebrates it. True civilization recognizes that the minds that think differently are often the minds that see furthest. You humans have learned this lesson. You are now ready to join our community. Not as subordinates, not as students, but as partners, as equals, as a species that understands that diversity is not weakness, it is strength." Robert Mitchell stood in the observation room at the United Nations headquarters, watching his son work with Krell colleagues on what they were calling the Universal Translator Project, an attempt to create systems that could bridge not just Krell and human communication, but potentially the languages of dozens of alien species. Tyler looked up and caught his father's eye through the glass. He smiled, a genuine unself-conscious smile that Robert had rarely seen from his son before this all began. It was the smile of someone who'd finally found where he belonged. Someone who'd finally found people who understood him. Earth had gone from being a cosmic footnote to becoming humanity's greatest strength. Not through military might or economic power. Not through politics or diplomacy in the traditional sense. Through one boy who thought differently. Through one child whose brain worked in ways that didn't fit normal patterns. Through an entire generation of kids who'd been told they were broken, who'd learned to believe it, until someone finally showed them that they weren't broken at all. They were the future. And as Tyler returned to his research with a sense of purpose and belonging that only the truly understood can feel, Earth quietly became known across the galaxy as something remarkable, the species that had learned to bridge worlds not through force, but through the beautiful, unconventional, extraordinary minds of those who thought differently. The message was clear. In a universe that valued conformity and linear thinking, the ones who dared to be different weren't mistakes. They were miracles,